In the suffocating darkness of the 41st millennium, there are sins that weigh heavier upon the soul of mankind than mere treachery. There is heresy, there is mutation, there is despair, but towering above them all, casting a shadow that poisons the very light of the Astronomicon, is a sin of a different magnitude. It is the sin of arrogance, the sin of hubris. It is the blasphemous, unthinkable belief that mortal hands riddled with imperfection and cancerous ambition can dare to improve upon the masterwork of a god. It is the cold, calculated conviction that men shrouded in ignorance and superstition can correct the divine architecture of the Emperor of mankind. This is the story of the Imperium's own Tower of Babel, a monument to ambition that reached too far, grasping for a perfection it could neither earn nor understand, only to collapse under the weight of its own catastrophic arrogance. This is the tale of the 21st founding. This is the unholy chronicle of the cursed. What is the cursed founding the imperial archives, those few that remain unsealed and unpurged by inquisitorial decree, speak of it with a hushed, terrified dread. It was the 21st mass founding of Adeptus Astartes chapters, a grand project initiated in the dark heart of the 36th millennium. This was not an age of glory. It was an era of shadow, a time of systemic madness. This epoch had a name that resonated with the terror of its days, the Age of Apostasy. While the Imperium has launched countless foundings before and since, marshalling its genetic resources to create new phalanxes of angels, none earned the epithet that clings to this one: the Cursed. This is not merely a title given in hindsight. It is a brand, a stain of damnation that marks every chapter, born from its secretive genetic vats, a permanent shadow that haunts every record of their creation. It was a bold, ambitious attempt to forge new angels of death, new blades for the Emperor's defense in a time of ultimate need. But what emerged from those blood-dark laboratories, what was unleashed upon an unsuspecting galaxy, was something else entirely. But when we speak of the madness of the cursed founding, we are not merely referring to the grotesque physical mutations that would later define it. We are not just speaking of the claws, the scales, the horns, the spontaneous immolations, or the catastrophic supernatural misfortune that followed these new chapters like a predator. No, those are but the symptoms, the grotesque, screaming symptoms of a deeper disease. The true madness, the foundational, unforgivable insanity, was the ambition that birthed the entire project. It was the hubris of the High Lords of Terror. Enthroned in their gilded, continent-spanning towers, they looked upon the saviors of the Imperium, the Space Marines, and saw not heroes, but flaws. They saw the black rage of the noble blood angels, the genetic instability of the space wolves Wolfen, the missing organs of the imperial fists, and deemed them inefficient, imperfect, broken. They looked upon the living, breathing legacy of the Primarchs, the demigod sons of the Emperor, and dared to whisper, "We can do better." It was the equal madness of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Specifically, it was the obsession of the radical magi-biologists of Mars who saw in this imperial desperation their ultimate opportunity. For millennia they had studied the Emperor's work, but they did not just seek to replicate it. They sought to master it. They saw the gene seed not as a sacred relic, but as flawed code. They promised a new breed of Astartes, Space Marines purified of their genetic quirks, stabilized, enhanced, warriors of absolute loyalty untainted by the melancholic, tragic failings of their progenitors. This was the madness of attempting to play God in an age where the only true God was silent upon his golden throne. And this collective madness, this shared delusion, was fueled by the desperation of a dying empire. The Age of Apostasy was a cancer devouring the Imperium from within. Goge Van Diere, the High Lord of the Administratum, turned ecclesiarchal tyrant, had drenched the segmentum in his monstrous rain of blood. The Imperium was tearing itself apart. Faith was broken. The established institutions were mired in a bloody galaxy-spanning civil war. The existing Space Marine chapters were stretched to their breaking point, fighting back Vandire's madness, battling resurgent Xenos, and holding back the ever-present tide of chaos. The High Lords, terrified of losing their grip, needed a new force. A force loyal not just to the distant concept of the Emperor, but to them. A force forged in their image of perfection. And so the experiment began. In secret, in laboratories buried deep beneath the red sands of Mars and on cloistered fortress moons, they ignored every warning, every sacred text that forbade such tampering. They tinkered with the very essence of the Emperor's craft, delving into forces that transcended mere science forces, that touched the soul, the warp, and the very fabric of fate. They sought to build perfect soldiers, and in their haste, their pride, and their unforgivable arrogance, they threw open a doorway to damnation. This is the chronicle of that damnation. We will unseal the forbidden records. We will walk the blood-stained halls of the Ordo Hereticus and examine the case files of the damned. We will analyze the aberrations, the monsters, and the martyrs created by this grand folly. From the noble tragedy of the Lamenters to the grotesque blessings of the Black Dragons. We will investigate the darkest, most heretical rumors, the whispers of chimeric gene seed, the blasphemous attempts to purify the genetic stock of the traitor legions themselves. Join us as we dissect the greatest single act of scientific hubris in the Imperium's long and bloody history, and expose why this arrogant reach for perfection forged not angels, but some of the Imperium's most magnificent, terrifying, and tragic devils. To understand the madness that spawned the cursed founding, you must first understand the madness of the era that demanded it. The 36th Millennium was not an age of heroes. It was a galactic cesspit of paranoia, corruption, and systemic failure. It was the age of apostasy, and at its rotting heart sat one man, Goge Vandire. His name is still invoked as a curse by the pious. He was the 361st High Lord of the Administratum, but through brutal political maneuvering, blackmail, and outright assassination, he seized control of the Adeptus Ministorum as well. He became the Ecclesiarch, holding the two most powerful positions in the Imperium simultaneously. It was a concentration of power unseen since the dark days of the heresy, and he wielded it like a bloody cudgel. This was the reign of blood. Vandire, consumed by a paranoid dementia, declared the Imperium steeped in sin and unleashed the Ecclesiarchy as his personal army of purification. Worlds burned on his whim. Billions were sacrificed in orgies of misplaced faith. His personal bodyguard, the fanatics known as the Brides of the Emperor, enforced his insane edicts, slaughtering anyone deemed impure, which in time came to mean anyone who questioned his absolute authority. The Imperium was not fighting the Xenos. It was not fighting the arch-enemy. It was fighting itself. A catastrophic galaxy-spanning civil war erupted, pitting the Ecclesiarchy and its vast armies against the Adeptus Terra, the Imperial Navy, and those few institutions brave enough to resist. The fabric of Imperial rule, already strained, was tearing apart at the seams. Trust in the High Lords, trust in the priesthood, trust in the very systems designed to protect mankind had utterly collapsed. Where were the Space Marines in this? They were the thin ceramite line holding back the tide. Chapters like the Imperial Fists, the Black Templars, and the Space Wolves fought with desperate fury to contain Vandire's madness, to hold splintering systems together, and to prevent the entire Imperium from plunging into a second age of strife. They were stretched to the point of breaking. They were bleeding. They were dying, fighting not glorious Xenos, but misguided human zealots. And in the gilded halls of terror, the other High Lords, those who conspired in shadows to end Vandire's reign, watched this with growing terror. They saw the Astartes, the Emperor's angels, as their only salvation, but also as a terrifyingly independent variable. The memory of Horus, though millennia distant, is a scar that never truly heals. They saw the existing chapters as unreliable. They looked upon the heroic blood angels and saw not just saviors, but the ticking time bomb of the Black Rage and the Red Thirst. How long until a chapter master succumbed, turning his forces against a vital ally in a fit of delusion? They looked at the Space Wolves and saw the Wolfen a genetic deviancy that bordered on mutation, a wildness they could not control. They saw the strain on every chapter, the flaws and deficiencies that made them imperfect tools. In their desperation and paranoia, a new toxic idea took root. They did not just need more space marines, they needed better ones. They needed a new generation of Astartes forged not in the shadow of the Primarch's tragic legacies, but in the cold, calculated light of Terran design. They craved a force of post-human warriors whose loyalty was absolute, not to their distant progenitors or archaic traditions, but to the High Lords of Terra. A force without the inconvenient genetic curses that plagued the First Founding's noblest sons. And as they whispered this impossible, arrogant desire, new voices answered from the red shadows of Mars. The Adeptus Mechanicus, ever the opportunists, saw this crisis not as a threat, but as the chance of a millennium. For centuries, the most radical magi biologists, the gene rights of the Omnissiah, had chafed under the restrictions of imperial dogma. They had studied the gene seed, the Emperor's sacred work, and like the High Lords, they saw only imperfection. They saw the flaws not as divine tragedies, but as correctable errors. They believed they had isolates to the genetic markers for the Red Thirst. They claimed they could stabilize the unstable. They whispered that they could remove the taint of mutation. They came to the desperate High Lords not with a request, but with a proposal, a temptation. The work of the Emperor is divine. They hissed their voices, a static rasp of logic. But the vessel is flawed. The Primarchs were scattered, their legacies compromised. We can restore the original template. We can fix the gene seed. Give us the resources, give us the authority, and we will give you the perfect soldier. An Astartes free of rage, free of mutation, and bound by your will. It was the ultimate expression of hubris. A cabal of paranoid politicians and amoral scientists believing they could improve upon the work of a god. In the darkest hour of the age of apostasy, shrouded in the blood mist of Vandir's madness, the High Lords of Terra looked upon this Martian proposal, and they agreed. The seeds of the cursed founding were sown. The proposal from Mars was not merely a scientific abstract. It was a siren's call to the desperate and the arrogant. It was the promise of perfection. The magi-biologists who championed this grand experiment did not see themselves as heretics. They saw themselves as reformers, as true visionaries of the Omnissiah. They believed they were finally truly understanding the Emperor's grandest design, and that they alone possessed the genius and the courage to complete it. Their ambition was built on a precise, logical, and utterly blasphemous set of objectives. The central pillar of their promise was correction. They laid out in meticulous, cog-toothed logic their plan to repair the divine legacy of the Primarchs. They presented the High Lords with a vision of a new, flawless Adeptus Astartes. First and most critically was the elimination of negative genetic traits. They promised an end to the Black Rage. No longer would the sons of Sanguinius be lost to a psychic echo of their father's death, turning them into uncontrollable berserkers. They promised a cure for the Red Thirst, that insidious craving for blood that haunted the Blood Angels and their successors. They promised they could stabilize the unstable genome of the Space Wolves, finally silencing the howl of the Wolfen that lurked in their blood. They promised to restore the missing organs of the Imperial Fists, to smooth out the melancholic nature of the Raven Guard. Every unique trait, every tragic flaw that defined the legacies of the First Founding, the Magi saw as a variable to be isolated, targeted, and excised. But their ambition did not stop at mere repair. They also promised enhancement. Why simply remove a flaw when one could amplify a virtue? They spoke of increasing the already prodigious strength of the Salamander's lineage, of sharpening the already keen tactical acumen of the Ultramarines' successors. Their most whispered promise, the one that truly seduced the High Lords, was the concept of programmed loyalty. They believed they could manipulate the gene seed not just physically, but behaviorally. They envisioned chapters that were hardwired for obedience not to a distant emperor or a nebulous Imperium, but to the Adeptus Terra itself. They were not just building weapons. They were building tame weapons. To achieve this, they would need genetic material, a vast repository of gene seed drawn from the titanic vaults on both Terra and Mars. And here, in the shadows of this great project, lies the darkest and most forbidden secret of the 21st founding. The High Lords and the Magi-biologists were not content to work merely with the known stable gene lines of the 9 loyalist Primarchs. The desperation of the Age of Apostasy and the sheer unfathomable hubris of the project's architects drove them to consider the unthinkable. It is a rumor, a heresy so profound that to speak it aloud is to court immediate execution by the Inquisition. But it is a rumor that persists with the tenacity of a demonic curse. They sought the forbidden gene stock. They opened the stasis vaults that held the gene seed of the traitor legions. This was the pinnacle of their madness. They looked upon the tainted, corrupted legacy of Horus Lupercal, of Fulgrim, the Phoenician of Angron, the Berserker of Mortarion, the plague-ridden, and they did not see irredeemable corruption. They saw potential. They saw raw material. In their cold, logical calculus, they believed that chaos was merely a psychic infection, a data corruption that could be purged. They convinced themselves that they could take the gene seed of the Iron Warriors, renowned for their mastery of siegecraft and their callous resilience, and cleanse it of Perturabo's bitterness and paranoia, reprogramming it for loyalty to Terra. They dreamed of harnessing the lightning-fast reflexes of Fulgrim's sons, stripped of their degenerate perfectionism. They even, it is whispered, considered the gene seed of Horus himself, believing they could isolate the Primarch's charisma and strategic genius, while scouring away the taint of the arch-traitor. This was not science. This was alchemy. This was a spiritual gamble of the highest, most insane order. They were attempting to separate the light from the shadow in a substance that was, by its very nature, defined by both. They failed to understand that the gene seed was not just a string of biological code. It was a spiritual inheritance. It contained a psychic echo, a sliver of the soul of the Primarch who sired it. And in the case of the traitors, that soul was irrevocably damned, pledged to the ruinous powers. To believe they could scrub the influence of chaos from this essence was like believing one could scrub the wetness from water. But in the throes of their collective delusion, no warning could pierce their armor of self-assurance. The cautious voices within the Mechanicus were silenced, branded as reactionaries. The warnings of the Inquisition were circumvented, the entire project hidden behind the highest possible classifications of the Officio Assassinorum and the High Lord's own seals. The experiment began. Across the Imperium, in secret laboratories shielded from the Astronomican's light, and in vast cathedral-like biovats on Mars, the great work commenced. The gene seed loyalist and perhaps traitor was brought forth. It was subjected to arcane biorites, alchemical processes, and genetic butchery that defied all established protocols. The Magi-biologists involved worked with a feverish excitement, a religious zeal. They were the new priests of creation, and they were birthing a new generation of gods. They tinkered, they spliced, they purified. They combined strains, creating unholy chimeras that blended the legacies of multiple Primarchs, a blasphemy that would have horrified the Emperor. The vats churned. The incubation pods were filled. And as the first malformed, tragically flawed, and utterly cursed Astartes began to awaken, the architects of the 21st founding looked upon their work with pride. They did not see the shadow they had just cast across the future of the Imperium. They saw only the reflection of their own terrible genius. The gestation was complete. The great work, the secret salvation of the Imperium, was finished. From the gene vats of Mars and a dozen hidden fortress moons, a new wave of space marines was born. The 21st founding was declared in hushed, triumphant tones within the most secure chambers on Terra. The exact number of new chapters forged in this single audacious act remains one of the most closely guarded secrets of the Imperium. Some penitent records suggest over 100. Others imply the number was far greater. They were given names that spoke of strength, loyalty, and imperial virtue: the Black Dragons, the Lamenters, the Firehawks, the Sons of Antaeus, the Flame Falcons. Each was granted a chapter master, a new forged banner, a fleet of warships, and a sacred duty. There was no grand parade on Terra. There was no celebration beneath the hollow gaze of the Emperor. This new generation of angels was born in shadow, and to shadow they were sent. They were immediately and deliberately dispatched to the darkest corners of the galaxy, hurled into the most desperate and forgotten war zones. The High Lords and the Magi Biologies declared this was to blood their new creations to test their perfection in the crucible of the most unforgiving conflicts. The truth was simpler: it kept them far from inquisitive eyes, far from the judgment of existing chapters, far from the lethal scrutiny of the ordos of the Inquisition. In the beginning there was silence. The High Lords of Terra and the architects on Mars interpreted this void of information as success. The cogs of their great machine were turning. Their perfect warriors were prosecuting the Emperor's wars with silent programmed efficiency. Weeks turned into months. The age of apostasy still raged, but the High Lords felt a new confidence secure in the knowledge that their secret, flawless army was turning the tide in the dark. Then the first reports began to filter back. They did not come through official Astartes channels. They came as terrified, fragmented astropathic whispers from Imperial Guard commanders, from frantic rogue traders, and from horrified Imperial Navy admirals. The messages were not declarations of glorious victory. They were confused. They were requests for clarification. They were reports of anomalies. A Lord General on the Segmentum Pacificus border reported that the Black Dragons chapter, while fighting with suicidal ferocity against an Orc War-G, was exhibiting physiological irregularities. His report spoke of Astartes, whose battle brothers had to forcibly restrain them from frenzies, and in an addendum marked, "For Lord Commander's eyes only," he spoke of battlefield rumors. Whispers of Marines fighting with bony extrusions and unnatural claw-like growths emerging from their limbs. From the Sabbat worlds, a fleet admiral sent a coded plea. The Lamenters chapter, assigned to his crusade, was prosecuting the war with courage, but they were magnets for disaster. Every engagement they joined, no matter how carefully planned, devolved into a catastrophic bloodbath. Ships translated from the warp directly into minefields. Ammunition depots exploded for no reason. Victories were secured, yes, but at a cost so profound, the Admiral wrote, that 2 more such victories will see my entire battle fleet annihilated. It is as if they are followed by a curse, and from across the Imperium, the reports echoed each other in their disturbing nature. Astounding, unthinkable rates of gene seed mutation. Tithes returned to Mars were found to be so deviant, so unstable, that the Magi assigned to assess them reflexively executed the servitors handling the samples and purged the entire laboratory. There were reports of entire squads of flame falcons spontaneously combusting in uncontrolled psychic fire while in prayer. There were whispers of Sons of Antaeus Marines who were impossibly unnaturally resilient, shrugging off wounds that would fell a Terminator, but who moved with a sluggish, melancholic stupor. The reaction from the High Lords and the Mechanicus leadership was not horror, it was denial, it was fury. These reports were dismissed with contemptuous speed. The High Lords declared them the product of battlefield hysteria. The Imperial Guard commanders were unused to the ferocity of true Astartes warfare. The admirals were incompetent and seeking a scapegoat for their own failures. The mutation's acceptable deviation, the Magi Biologies insisted. The gene seed is merely adapting, settling the strange combat behaviors. The chapters are establishing their unique martial traditions, they argued. The training was incomplete. It requires battlefield application. They built a wall of classified documents and bureaucratic denial. They could not be wrong. Their genius, their arrogance was absolute. To admit failure was to admit a heresy far greater than any mere mutation. But the truth is a tide of acid. It does not care for the walls of men. The reports kept coming. They grew more frequent, more specific, and more terrifying. The fragmented whispers of anomalies were coalescing into a single galaxy-spanning scream of abomination. The secret was unraveling, and deep within the shadowed halls of the Inquisition, instruments of paranoia honed over 10,000 years, the first true alarm bells were beginning to sound. If the cursed founding has a single undeniable poster child, a living, breathing monument to the Mechanicus' catastrophic failure, it is the chapter known as the Black Dragons. Of all the aberrations that slithered from the gene vats of the 21st founding, theirs is perhaps the most overt, the most visceral, and the most shamefully visible. Their flaw is not a subtle instability. It is not a psychic quirk or a streak of bad luck. It is a profound physical corruption of the Astartes, form a mutation so stable and so pronounced that it has become the defining characteristic of their entire brotherhood. The chapter itself refers to them as the ossific protrusions. The wider Imperium has a simpler, more terrified name for them, the Claws. As a black dragon battle brother matures, as his body processes the sacred gene seed, a terrible transformation begins. Spurs of dense obsidian black bone, thick as a man's wrist, begin to pierce the skin of their forearms. They elongate, sharpening into brutal keratinous blades that extend a foot or more past the fingertips. These are not frail vestigial things. They are living weapons harder than steel, capable of shearing through flak armor, rending Xenos flesh, and even parrying a chainsword. In many warriors, this uncontrolled ossification continues erupting from their skulls in the form of bony crests, ridges, and horns, twisting the noble profile of an Astartes into something bestial and demonic. Their appearance is a grotesque parody of the divine human form. They are monsters cloaked in the sacred black ceramite of a space marine. And here in this physical horror, we find the true distilled madness of the Black Dragons. They do not view this as a mutation. They do not see it as a curse, a flaw, or a mark of shame. They call it a blessing. This is the core of their chapter doctrine, the hill upon which their collective sanity has died. The Black Dragons fervently, zealously believe that these monstrous claws and horns are a physical manifestation of the Emperor's divine favor. They see themselves as chosen, as a purer, truer expression of the Emperor's wrath. Their mutation is not a sign of imperfection. It is a holy stigmata, a tool granted to them by the Master of Mankind to better prosecute his wars. This belief informs their entire way of war. They are zealots, unbound fanatics of the highest order. A black dragon in battle is a terrifying sight, a whirlwind of black armor and bloody claws. They hurl themselves into the thickest fighting with a suicidal savagery that makes even the flesh-tearers pause. They embrace the close-quarters melee, eschewing the bolter for the visceral, intimate thrill of tearing their enemies apart with the blessings the Emperor gave them. Their fury is absolute, a berserker rage that rivals the darkest legends of the World Eaters. But this fury is not born of chaos-tainted butcher's nails. It is born of fanatical, unswerving devotion. Their battle cries are not for blood, but for the Emperor. Their loyalty to the Imperium is as extreme and pronounced as their mutation. They are in their own minds the ultimate purifiers, and their grotesque forms are the very image of imperial justice. They must be. To believe otherwise, to accept for even a second that they are mutants, would be to shatter the very foundation of their existence. So from what well of ambition did this specific nightmare spring? How did the Magi biologists in their quest for perfection create this? The gene scanners of the Inquisition and the cloistered logic engines of Mars point to one deeply ironic origin, the gene seed of the salamanders, the lineage of the noble Primarch Vulcan. It seems the architects of the 21st founding looked upon the 16th Legion's legacy and saw a promising stable foundation. The salamanders were already known for their physical divergence, their obsidian black skin, their burning ember-like eyes. They were also renowned for their incredible strength and a resilience that bordered on the supernatural. The Magi biologists, in their infinite hubris, must have seen this not as a complete and sacred design, but as a template to be improved. Their goal, the archives suggest, was to enhance these traits, to take Vulcan's resilience and amplify it, to take his strength and perfect it. They wanted to create a chapter of super salamanders warriors who were even tougher, even stronger, even more unyielding. And in their clumsy, arrogant tinkering, they broke something vital. They shattered the delicate, divine safeguards that Vulcan's own essence had encoded within the gene seed. They pushed the biological processes of adaptation and resilience past their limits. The gene seed in its corrupted state began to overcompensate. It did not just make the Marines resilient, it began to grow external bony armor. It did not just make them strong, it gave them primal animalistic weapons. The Magi had not created an improved protector as Vulcan was. They had twisted his legacy of strength and endurance into a monstrous predatory caricature. The cursed founding had taken the most humane and compassionate of the first founding lines, and in its quest for physical perfection, had forged a legion of beautiful, loyal beasts. The existence of the Black Dragons presents the Imperium with a profound, agonizing paradox. It is a contradiction that cuts to the very core of imperial doctrine, a question that the High Lords and the Inquisition have struggled with for millennia. What do you do with a monster that worships your god? This is the central conflict of the Black Dragons' cursed lives. They are heroes. This is an undeniable empirical fact written in the blood of 10,000 Xenos battlefields. They have fought, bled, and died for the Emperor with a zealotry that puts many purer chapters to shame. They have held lines that should have broken. They have purged worlds that were deemed lost causes. Their record of loyalty when measured in victories and tithes of blood is impeccable. And yet, they are mutants. This too is an undeniable fact. Their very presence is a mockery of the sacred human form. They are an affront to the imperial creed, which dictates that the mutant must be purged, the unclean burned, the deviant put to the sword. The Black Dragons are a walking, breathing, screaming embodiment of the very thing the Imperium fears and hates. They are a living refutation of the idea that the Emperor's work is perfect. They are the cursed founding made flesh, a constant, ugly reminder of a sin that terror wishes to forget. This paradox, the mutant hero, the loyal abomination, places them in a permanent, agonizing state of suspicion. No chapter in the entirety of the Imperium, save perhaps their fellow damned of the 21st founding, exists under a more intense and hateful scrutiny. Chief among their persecutors is the Ordo Hereticus. The witch hunters of the Inquisition see the Black Dragons not as blessed but as damned. They look at their osseous claws and demonic horns, and they do not see the Emperor's blessing. They see the clear, unequivocal mark of chaos. They see the touch of Khorne in their battlefield fury. They see the warping influence of Tzeentch in their twisted forms. To the Ordo Hereticus, the Black Dragon's zealous loyalty is not proof of their purity, but rather the ultimate deception. It is a mask, a cunning lie crafted by the ruinous powers to embed their corrupted agents deep within the Imperium's defenses. Consequently, the Black Dragons are forever hunted. Their fleets are shadowed by the black ships of the Inquisition. Their every action is recorded, every battle analyzed, every word scrutinized for the slightest hint of heresy. Inquisitors embed themselves within their fortress monastery, living among them. As observers, their psychic senses, and armed retinues a constant chilling presence. More than one black dragon has been taken in the dead of night to the interrogation chambers of an inquisitorial cruiser, never to be seen again. They are tested, purged, and assayed for corruption on a constant basis, enduring trials that would drive lesser men to madness or rebellion. This is the terrible price of their difference. The black dragons understand this. They know how the galaxy sees them. They know that to the rest of the Imperium they are monsters. And this knowledge fuels their zealotry to an even more terrifying extreme. They must be loyal beyond all question. They must be pure beyond all reproach. They cannot afford the luxury of nuance, the comfort of doubt, or the weakness of mercy. Where another chapter might bypass a world of minor Xenos taint, the black dragons will exterminate it to the last child, just to prove they harbor no sympathy for the unclean. Where another chapter might show strategic patience, the black dragons will lead the suicidal frontal assault, just to prove their courage and loyalty are absolute. They must prove every single day in every single battle that their hideous forms belie a pure heart. They must fight 10 times as hard, bleed 10 times as much, and die in 10 times the numbers of any other chapter, all for the simple privilege of existing. Their savagery is their weapon, but it is also their chain. The more they give in to the berserker fury, their blessing provides, the more they prove their loyalty through violence. Yet the more they do so, the more they resemble the very Cornat butchers the Inquisition accuses them of being. They are trapped in a perfect Grimdark feedback loop. Their mutation demands they be zealous. Their zealotry manifests as savagery. Their savagery confirms the Imperium's suspicion. The suspicion demands they prove their loyalty through even greater acts of zealous savagery. And so the cycle of the cursed founding grinds on, forging its monstrous heroes in an endless fire of their own making. If the black dragons are the most visible physical testament to the cursed founding's failure, our next case study is its most profound and tragic soul. We move from the madness of the flesh to the madness of fate itself. We move from the blessing of claws to the curse of eternal misfortune. We speak now of the chapter whose very name is a prayer for the dead, the lamenters. To understand their tragedy, we must first look to their noble, blighted origin. The lamenters are sons of Sanguinius. They are inheritors of the gene seed of the blood angels. This lineage was without question a primary target for the magi biologists of the 21st founding. The architects of the project looked upon the blood angels and their successors and saw the pinnacle of Astartes' perfection marred by two catastrophic soul-deep flaws, the Black Rage and the Red Thirst. The Black Rage, a psychic echo of their Primarch's murder, which doomed his sons to relive his final agonizing moments in a fit of uncontrollable delusional fury. The Red Thirst, an insidious craving for blood that constantly gnawed at their self-control, a dark shadow that threatened to turn saviors into predators. These flaws were unacceptable to the cold logic of the High Lords and the gene rights of Mars. They were inefficiencies, they were risks, and in the full flower of their hubris, the Magi Biologies declared that they would fix them. They would cure the sons of Sanguinius. They would unravel the divine psychic tragedy woven into the very essence of their being and simply delete it. Their goal was to create a new breed of blood angel, a chapter that possessed all of Sanguinius's grace, his artistry in war, his angelic nobility, and his superhuman prowess, but with none of the weakness of his tragic curse. They took the sacred gene seed, the very spiritual inheritance of the great angel, and they subjected it to their cold, profane scalpels. They tore it apart, analyzed its psychic resonance, and in their infinite, arrogant wisdom, they rewrote it. They snipped the psychic thread that bound them to their father's death. They attempted to cauterize the spiritual wound that caused the thirst, and in a horrifying, twisted way, they succeeded. The Lamenters were born, and they were at first a triumph. They were stable. They were noble. They were everything the Magi had promised. They were sons of Sanguinius, free from the Black Rage. The psychic trauma that had defined their entire lineage for 10 millennia was simply gone. The red thirst, while still present, was a muted, manageable whisper, not the roaring, demanding hunger of their cousins. The experiment, it seemed, was a staggering, unparalleled success. But the Magi biologists, in their materialist ignorance, had failed to understand what they were toying with. They believed the Black Rage was a mere genetic error, a psychic aberration to be corrected. They did not understand that it was part of a complex, tragic, and divine spiritual architecture. It was the price of their nobility. It was the shadow that gave their light meaning. In curing their rage, the Magi had not healed the wound. They had merely displaced it. They had broken something fundamental, not in the Lamenter's bodies, but in their very souls. They had severed their connection to their Primarch's glorious, defiant death, and in doing so had left them adrift in a sea of metaphysical despair. The result was the true curse of the Lamenters. The Black Rage was replaced by a perpetual, crippling melancholy, a bone-deep psychic sorrow that saturated their entire being. They were and are a chapter defined by overwhelming grief, a sadness they cannot explain for a loss they cannot identify. But this spiritual void did more than just make them sad. It created a vacuum. It was an unnatural tear in the fabric of reality, a perversion of fate. And into this tear the universe poured all of its malice. The Lamenters were cured of their internal flaw, only to be saddled with an external supernatural one, catastrophic, unrelenting, and inescapable bad luck. They are avatars of misfortune. They are a magnet for disaster. Where the Black Dragons are defined by what is added to their bodies, the Lamenters are defined by what is taken from their fate. They are a blight upon any campaign they join, a walking omen of doom. They are quite possibly the most tragic of all the Emperor's servants. They were perfected by men who mistook the soul for a machine, and as a result, they were damned by the universe itself. The history of the Lamenters chapter is not a roll of honors. It is a litany of tragedies. It is a chronicle of failure so complete, so consistent, that it defies all statistical probability. Their curse is not a theory. It is a portfolio of documented soul-crushing disasters. Shortly after their founding, their entire chapter fleet, pristine and new-forged, was sent to reinforce the Segmentum Tempestus. They translated from the Imperium and vanished. For over a century, the Lamenters were declared perdita, lost to the warp, another failed experiment consumed by the void. When they finally reappeared, battered and bleeding, it was only to find themselves sailing directly into the jaws of Hive Fleet Kraken. They were one of the very first chapters to make contact with the Tyrannid menace, and for this honor they were not lauded as heroes. They were simply devoured. They were ravaged, their numbers cut down by 90%, their precious perfected gene seed stocks almost entirely obliterated in a desperate, hopeless, and forgotten last stand. They were rebuilt slowly and painfully over centuries, and for their loyalty, they were assigned to the Maelstrom Zone, a place of perpetual shadow and war. It was here they were drawn into the Imperium's next great internal conflict, the Badab War, and in the ultimate agonizing twist of their cursed fate, the Lamenters, perhaps the most fundamentally decent and loyal chapter in the Imperium, chose the wrong side. They sided with Lugfturon, the tyrant of Badab, against the Imperium. Why not out of malice? Not out of ambition or nascent heresy, but out of compassion. They saw the Maelstrom Warders, the chapters under Huron's command, as fellow protectors abandoned by a distant and callous terror. They believed they were fighting for the common folk of the Badab sector. They were manipulated, their inherent nobility and empathy twisted into a tool for rebellion. When the war inevitably ended, and the brutal Minotaurs and other loyalist chapters brought them to heel, the Lamenters were declared traitors, their honor shattered, their entire chapter sentenced to a century-long penitent crusade. And this is the devastating, beautiful, grimdark irony of the Lamenters. This is the heart of their madness. Despite this unending cascade of failure, despite this supernatural malice from the universe itself, Despite being abandoned, devoured, and declared traitors, their loyalty is unbreakable. Their spirit is pure. In a galaxy of brutal fascists, callous warlords, and zealous butchers, the Lamenters are a stark, tragic anomaly. They are humanists. They weep for the civilians they failed to protect. They will divert their entire force against all strategic logic and in defiance of direct orders to save a single hab block. They are known to paint a single black teardrop on their pale yellow armor, a permanent mark of the sorrow they carry. They are the sanguinary guard of the common man, the angelic protectors who remember the imperial truth, that almost all other Astartes have forgotten, that they exist to protect humanity, not just to rule it. They are in every measurable way everything the Magi biologists wanted to create: noble, courageous, selfless, and free of the Black Rage. And they are unequivocally the 21st Founding's greatest and most profound failure. The madness of their fate is the ultimate indictment of the entire project's arrogance. It proves that the gene seed is not a mere biological equation to be solved. The Magi, in their clinical materialist attempt to excise a flaw, broke something they couldn't even perceive. They tore a hole in the Lamenter's spiritual armor. They erased the tragic, defiant no that Sanguinius screamed at the universe before his death, the psychic defiance that perhaps shielded his sons from the worst of fate's malice. The Magi succeeded in removing the rage, but in doing so, they left the Lamenter's collective soul naked and exposed. They are now a walking wound in the fabric of fate, attracting the malice of the cosmos as a corpse draws flies. Their curse is the universe's own hateful, sentient answer to the hubris of Mars. It is a divine, cosmic punishment for the sin of perfection, visited not upon the scientists who committed the sin, but upon the tragic noble sons they so hideously wronged. Thus far, we have chronicled the cursed Founding's overt failures. We have seen the grotesque mutation of the Black Dragons and the metaphysical tragedy of the Lamenters. But now we turn to a different, more chilling possibility. We turn to the madness not of catastrophic failure, but of terrifying, calculated success. We turn to the bronze-clad, emotionless, and utterly brutal chapter known as the Minotaurs. If the Lamenters are the weeping soul of the 21st Founding, the Minotaurs are its iron-shod boot. They are a force of pure, state-sanctioned terror. They operate with a level of resource and authority that is almost unmatched, wielding war gear of archaic and priceless quality, their fleets pristine and overwhelmingly powerful. They are rarely seen on the Imperium's external borders, fighting the Xenos or the heretic. Instead, their theater of war is the Imperium itself. The Minotaurs are the High Lord's hounds. They are the personal leashed attack dogs of the Senatorum Imperialis. Their sole-defining purpose is the censure and destruction of other Space Marine chapters. When a chapter is deemed rogue, when it questions the tithes of terror, when it steps even a single millimeter out of line, the Minotaurs are unleashed. They do not negotiate. They do not offer terms. They descend with overwhelming, grinding, and remorseless force. They are infamous for their callous disregard for collateral damage, slaughtering Imperial Guard allies and civilian populations who get in their way. They are the Astartes killers, the ultimate tool of internal control, and they answer to no one save their masters on Terra. Their loyalty is absolute, it is unwavering, and it is this very loyalty that is the source of their terrifying madness. They are not loyal to the Emperor, not truly. They are not loyal to the concept of the Imperium or the people it protects. They are loyal with a fanaticism that borders on the programmatic to the office of the High Lords. And here we find the link. The origins of the Minotaurs are avoid an impenetrable wall of secrecy and classified dogma. No one knows their Primarch. No one knows their homeworld. Their records are sealed by the High Lords themselves. This has led inevitably to the pervasive and deeply unsettling hypothesis that the Minotaurs are a product of the 21st Founding. They are perhaps the only true success of the entire benighted project. Think back to the original promise of the Magi biologists. They did not just promise to remove flaws, they promised to program loyalty. They promised the paranoid High Lords a force of Astartes, bound not by honor or tradition, but by genetic imperative loyal only to them. The Minotaurs are the living, breathing, terrifying fulfillment of that promise. They are the perfection the cursed founding sought to achieve, warriors stripped of empathy, compassion, and independent thought, existing only to obey the will of terror. Their success is in many ways a more profound monstrosity than any claw or curse, but what raw material could have been used to forge such a perfect, heartless weapon? This leads us to the darkest theory of all, the one whispered by the most senior inquisitors and the most fearful chapter masters. What if the gene seed was not from a loyalist Primarch at all? The Minotaurs fight with a specific grinding and overwhelmingly brutal form of siegecraft. They are masters of attrition, methodical, callous, and perfectly coordinated. They treat their fellow Astartes not as wayward brothers, but as fortifications to be torn down, problems to be solved with mathematical, overwhelming force. This combat doctrine mirrors with chilling precision the doctrines of one of the traitor legions, the Iron Warriors. The hypothesis is that the Magi biologists, in their ultimate hubris, took the gene seed of the arch-traitor Perturabo, the master of the bitter siege, the paranoid, resentful demigod, and believed they could reprogram it. They thought they could harness the Iron Warrior's resilience and methodical spite, scouring it of its chaos taint and its resentment of authority, replacing it with an unthinking absolute loyalty to a new authority. Or perhaps they created a chimera blending the Iron Warrior's ruthless efficiency with the genetic markers for obedience taken from a dozen other lines. The result is a chapter of unparalleled brutality, possessing the cold, calculating spite of Perturabo, but with its loyalty dial turned to maximum and aimed squarely at terror. The madness of the Minotaurs is the madness of controlled success. It is the chilling realization that the High Lords looked at the failures of the Black Dragons and Lamenters and learned. They learned not to stop their profane work, but how to do it better. How to create a monster that was not just loyal, but useful. Not all of the cursed founding's spawn were defined by physical mutation or metaphysical tragedy. Some were defined by a madness of the spirit, an obsession so total that it consumed their very being before culminating in one of the Imperium's most enduring and chilling mysteries. This is the story of the Firehawks, the chapter that flew too close to its own pyretic sun. Like the Black Dragons, the Firehawks were often, though contentiously, linked to the gene line of Vulcan and the Salamanders. But if they were indeed sons of Vulcan, they inherited none of his measured craft or his protective instinct. What they inherited, what the Magi biologist's tampering must have amplified to a monstrous degree, was his affinity for flame. They were not just pyromancers, they were pyromaniacs in the truest, most terrifying sense. Their chapter doctrine was a fanatical, all-consuming cult of fire. They saw in flame the ultimate expression of the Emperor's will. It was pure, it was absolute, and it was indiscriminate. It was the great purifier, the holy conflagration that would cleanse a galaxy steeped in sin. Their way of war was a terrifying spectacle of orchestrated arson. They deployed flame-based weaponry, flamers, melter incendiary shells with a profligacy that horrified their allies and annihilated their enemies. Their librarians specialized almost exclusively in pyromancy, conjuring infernos that could engulf entire city blocks. They did not just defeat their enemies, they immolated them. They left behind worlds scoured, clean continents, reduced to seas of cooling glass and black ash. Their battle cry was for the Emperor's flame, and they meant it with every fiber of their obsessive, burning souls. This obsession was their defining madness. It was a zeal that crossed the line from tactical preference into a deranged religious hysteria. And it was this fire that would ultimately consume them. In the 906th year of the 40th millennium, the entire Firehawks chapter fleet, over 1,000 Astartes strong, was on a routine patrol near the Crow's World subsector. They were responding to a distress call, a minor demonic incursion. It was a war they had fought 100 times before. Their fleet, led by the battle barge Raptorus, Rex prepared to transition into the Imperium. They engaged their warp drives and vanished. It was not a normal disappearance. It was not a fleet scattered by a storm or a few ships lost to the tides. The entire massive fleet, every ship, every marine, every servitor was gone in an instant. The warp signature was sheared off as if cut by a blade. No astropathic echo remained. No debris, no wreckage, just silence. The Firehawks were declared lost, with all hands their chapter's banner struck from the rolls of the Adeptus Astartes. Another failed experiment of the 21st, founding it seemed, had finally met its end. But the galaxy is a place of dark and terrible miracles. The story does not end there. For millennia, Imperial forces on the brink of annihilation have whispered of a miracle. In their darkest hour, when all hope is lost, ethereal shapes appear. Astartes wreathed in black armor adorned with skeletal motifs and ghostly flickering flames materialize from nowhere. They fight with the cold, silent fury of the dead, their bolters firing not explosive shells, but soul-burning, white-hot fire. They do not speak. They do not pause. They just kill. And when the battle is won as suddenly as they arrived, they vanish, leaving only the scent of ash and the charred bones of the enemy behind. They are known as the Legion of the Damned. For centuries, this was dismissed as battlefield hallucination, a divine vision granted to the dying. But the sightings are too many, the reports too consistent. And the core chilling hypothesis, one that links the cursed, founding to this supernatural phenomenon, is this: the Firehawks did not die in the warp. They changed. The theory is that their collective psychic obsession with fire, their absolute fanatical belief in purification by flame, resonated in the Imperium. The warp, the sea of raw emotion and belief, answered their call. It took their aberrant gene seed, their pyretic madness, and it transmuted them. It burned away their physical bodies and reforged them as entities of pure, vengeful fire and imperial loyalty. Their disappearance was not an accident. It was an ascension, a terrible Grimdark apotheosis. The madness of the Firehawks, instilled by the cursed founding, was so potent that it shattered the veil of reality, transforming an entire chapter of flawed Astartes into an eternal, ghostly instrument of the Emperor's vengeance. The Magibiologists had sought to create stable warriors, and they had instead, by catastrophic, universe-altering accident, created a legion of holy ghosts. Our menagerie of aberrations now leads us to one of the most physically imposing and psychologically unnerving products of the cursed founding. If the Lamenters are a tragedy of fate, and the Black Dragons a tragedy of the flesh, the Sons of Antaeus are a tragedy of the spirit, they represent a success so literal that it becomes a profound failure. The defining characteristic of the Sons of Antaeus is their almost supernatural resilience. They are giants even by the standards of the Adeptus Astartes. Their frames are broader, their bone density greater, their muscle mass impossibly thick. They tower over their Astartes cousins, their specialized Terminator armor, making them look more like walking dreadnoughts than living marines. This gigantism is matched by an endurance that is simply not natural. They possess a resistance to damage that borders on the miraculous, shrugging off bolter fire as if it were hail, and enduring wounds from heavy weapons that would obliterate a standard space marine. Their skin is thick and tough as tank plating, their regenerative abilities far in excess of the norm. In combat, they are living battering rams, immovable objects of ceramite and flesh. Their resilience has been compared in hushed and terrified tones to the unholy fortitude of the heretic Astartes of the Death Guard, though thankfully without the accompanying filth and disease. This surely was the goal. The Magibiologists must have set out to create the ultimate shock absorber, the perfect living bastion. They sought to forge a chapter of living tanks warriors who could absorb infinite punishment, who could hold any line, who could walk through a firestorm and emerge untouched. And in this they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. But for every gift granted by the 21st Founding's profane science, a terrible price was exacted. The sons of Antaeus have their unholy resilience, but they paid for it with their vitality. They are slow, not just physically slow, though their movements are indeed ponderous and lethargic, but slow in a more fundamental sense. They are slow of thought, slow of spirit. They are defined by a crushing, profound apathy. They lack all initiative, all tactical cunning, all the fiery drive that defines a space marine. They are melancholic and reactive. They do not attack, they endure. They do not conquer, they outlast. Their chapter culture is one of silence and resignation. They are the great grey stones of the Imperium, unmoving and seemingly eternal, but also cold and lifeless. Their commanders do not formulate brilliant strategies. They simply point their warriors at an objective and wait for the enemy to break against their impenetrable flesh. They are warriors of attrition, and the attrition, it seems, has worn away their very souls. This is the quiet failure of their creation. The Magi biologists, in their arrogance, focused entirely on the physical. They saw the Astartes as a biological weapons system and sought to maximize one variable durability. Perhaps they tinkered with gene stock famed for its endurance, Vulcans, or even Mortarian's cleansed line, and pushed it far beyond its intended limits. In doing so, they engineered the perfect defensive warrior, but they forgot the most crucial component of a soldier, the will to fight. They created a hammer so heavy that it cannot be swung with any vigor. They forged a shield that is impenetrable, but which has no desire to move forward, no impulse to protect anything beyond its own dull existence. The sons of Antaeus are a testament to the madness of materialist science, a walking melancholic reminder that a warrior is more than the sum of his toughness, and that in the quest for physical perfection it is all too easy to murder the soul. We have charted the madness of purification, enhancement, and programming, but the profane journey of the 21st Founding's architects did not stop there. In their pursuit of perfection, they were not content to merely fix the divine template of a single Primarch. They sought to transcend it. This led them to their most radical, their most arrogant, and their most catastrophically heretical technique, the creation of chimeric gene seed. This was the ultimate unforgivable blasphemy. The concept was, in their cold, cog-toothed logic, deceptively simple. If the gene seed of Sanguinius produced angelic grace, but was flawed by the rage, and if the gene seed of Robut Guilliman produced unmatched tactical acumen, then why not combine them? Why not take the best traits from two or more divine bloodlines, splice them together at the genetic level, and create a single, flawless warrior? Why settle for the Sons of Dawn or the Sons of Vulcan, when you could forge a new chapter that possessed the unyielding stoic defense of one and the fiery, compassionate endurance of the other? This was the Gene Wright's ultimate fantasy. It was the desire to play God, not just by editing a single creation, but by forging an entirely new one from divine clay. They looked upon the sacred holy gene seed of the Emperor's own sons not as a holistic spiritual inheritance, but as a biological toolkit, a set of genetic building blocks to be assembled, reassembled, and optimized at their whim. They willfully ignored the sacred 10,000-year-old dogma that forbade such blending, dismissing it as superstition, as the reactionary fear of the ignorant. They were men of logic, of science, and their logic dictated that this was the obvious, brilliant next step in post-human evolution. Their logic was pure, unadulterated madness. Their science was a butcher's art performed in the dark. What the Magi biologists, in their blinding materialist arrogance, utterly failed to comprehend was that the gene seed is not merely DNA. It is not just a biological blueprint for creating new organs, for enhancing bone density, for catalyzing muscle growth. The gene seed is a soul fragment, Every single strain of stable Astartes gene seed carries within it a psychic resonance, a spiritual echo of the Primarch who sired it. It is his will, his temperament, his shadow, his personality, his virtues, and most critically his flaws imprinted upon the very essence of his sons. This is why the Blood Angels are artistic noble, and yet cursed by the rage. This is why the Imperial Fists are stubborn to the point of suicidal self-destruction. This is why the Raven Guard are stealthy, patient, and haunted by a deep, abiding melancholy. They are not just inheriting biological traits, they are inheriting a sliver of their father's soul. And what the Cursed Founding's grand experiment did was take two or more of these volatile, godlike spiritual echoes and force them into a single mortal vessel. This was not a synthesis. It was a war. It was a psychic abomination. The resulting Astartes was not a harmonious blend of virtues. He was a walking, screaming spiritual battlefield. His very soul was being torn apart by the conflicting, warring instincts and divine legacies of his multiple progenitors. Imagine the unyielding, stoic, defensive nature of Dawn, forced to coexist with the savage, predatory, offensive fury of Leman Russ. Imagine the cold, calculating logic of the Iron Hands, forced into the same mind as the empathetic, humane fire of Vulcan. This internal conflict, this profound spiritual rejection of one divine essence by another, manifested as catastrophic terminal instability. The chimeric gene seed was at war with itself, and this war expressed itself in the most horrific ways imaginable. The bodies of the Astartes would reject their own newly grown organs. Their minds would shatter into 1,000 warring personalities. And in the most extreme, terrifying cases, the psychic friction would become so intense that it would literally tear a hole in the fabric of reality. This leads us to the horrifying cautionary tale of the Flame Falcons. They were one of the flagship chimeric experiments. The exact blend they were subjected to is a secret that has been purged by inquisitorial fire, but the result was a new and unique form of explosive madness. The Flame Falcons were, for a short and glorious time, stable. They fought, they served, they conquered. But as they aged, a terrible, unholy flaw began to manifest. It started with a faint aura, a smell of ozone and sulfur. Then often in the heat of battle, or even in the solemn, echoing halls of their chapels, it would happen. A battle brother would suddenly stiffen his hands, grasping at his helmet. He would scream, not in pain, but in a strange, psychic agony. And then a nimbus of white-hot, ethereal fire would erupt from his body. This was not the controlled pyromancy of the Firehawks. This was not the holy blessing of Vulcan. This was spontaneous, uncontrollable psychic combustion. The Astartes would be consumed from within his armor, melting into slag, his flesh and bone, and sacred organs turned to incandescent ash in a matter of seconds. This unholy fire, a physical manifestation of their warring gene seed, was so potent it could leap to their brothers, creating a chain reaction of spiritual immolation that could wipe out an entire squad. The Flame Falcons were not just unstable. They were living, ticking psychic bombs. Their end was as swift and absolute as their conflagration. After a particularly horrific incident where an entire company incinerated itself during a victory celebration on a newly conquered world, the Inquisition could no longer ignore the truth. The Flame Falcons were declared excommunicate traitoris. They were not just a failure, they were a profound existential danger to every living thing around them. They were hunted down and purged, their chimeric legacy erased from Imperial records in a blaze of their own unnatural fire. They were the ultimate screaming testament to the Cursed Founding's core, sin, the belief that the divine soul of a Primarch could be spliced, edited and controlled by the clumsy, arrogant hands of mortal men. We have analyzed the chimeras, the giants, the cursed, and the damned. But all these case studies orbit a single central and unforgivable heresy. A truth so dark it is almost never spoken aloud. We have hinted at it. We have discussed its hypothetical application in the Minotaurs. Now we must confront it directly, for it is the black, rotting heart of the 21st Founding's madness. They used the gene seed of the traitor legions. Let us be clear. In any other millennium, in any other era of Imperial history, the mere suggestion of such an act would be met with immediate, fiery execution. The Magi biologist who proposed it would be declared arch-heretic. His laboratories purged his name, erased from all records. But this was not any other era. This was the 36th millennium. This was the age of apostasy. The Imperium was eating itself alive. Gogevandire's reign of blood had fractured the very foundations of faith and power. The High Lords were not just desperate. They were clinically insane with paranoia and fear. They were backed into a corner watching their galaxy burn, and in that suffocating shadow, no idea was too heretical, no resource too tainted, no sin too great if it promised salvation. It was only in this specific crucible of galactic madness that the High Lords of Terror could have possibly, for one insane second, listened to the Magi biologist's ultimate proposal to reclaim the lost legions. To take the gene stock of Horus Angron Fulgrim and Perturabo from the stasis vaults where they were kept for study and destruction, and to purify them. To harness the strategic genius of the arch-traitor, the savage strength of the World Eaters, the perfection of the Emperor's children, and to scour them of chaos. This was the pinnacle of their hubris, the absolute terminal madness of their science. They believed they could edit damnation. They believed they could put a soul in a crucible, burn away the chaos, and be left with a pure, useful tool. It was, of course, a catastrophic, inevitable failure. They failed because they could never understand the nature of their foe. The gene seed of the traitors is not merely infected with chaos. It is not a biological host with a psychic parasite. It is of chaos. It is a spiritual conduit, a gateway, a willing participant in its own corruption. The taint of the ruinous powers is not a flaw to be removed. It is the defining characteristic of that genetic code. To believe you can scrub the chaos from Angron's gene seed is to believe you can scrub the wetness from water. The results of this ultimate folly are not as well documented as our other case studies, and for a simple reason: the failures were too absolute, too swift, too monstrous to be allowed to survive. Many of these purified chapters undoubtedly fell to chaos almost instantaneously, their first neophytes howling in demonic hunger before they had even donned their power armor. Others likely self-destructed in psychic fire like the Flame Falcons, or were so grotesquely mutated that they were purged by their own creators within their incubation vats. But here lies the most insidious thought. What if some didn't fail so overtly? What if the purification process merely changed the expression of chaos? What if the taint was not removed but simply disguised? Look again at the black dragons. We call their claws a mutation, a failed attempt to enhance Vulcan's line. But what if they are, in fact, the purified seed of Angron? What if their berserker zeal and bony protrusions are not a blessing, but the first subtle, loyal manifestation of Khorne's corrupting gift? This is the true, lingering horror of the 21st Founding. The madness was not just that they failed. The madness is that they may have succeeded in the worst possible way, by creating monsters who do not even know they are monsters. By creating loyal servants of the Imperium, whose very genes are a ticking time bomb, a gateway for the arch-enemy disguised as a divine flaw. They sought to steal fire from the demonic forge, and in their arrogance they allowed the forge's embers to nest in the very heart of the Imperium. The wall of denial built by the High Lords and the Magi biologists was formidable, but it was not impenetrable. The fragmented, terrified reports of claws, curses, and spontaneous psychic immolations could be dismissed individually as battlefield hysteria. But taken together, the pattern was undeniable, and it painted a picture of such profound systemic failure that it finally irrevocably triggered the most paranoid and powerful organization in the galaxy, the Inquisition noticed, specifically the Ordo Hereticus and the Ordo Malleus, the Witch Hunters and the Demon Hunters. Their agents embedded throughout the Imperium began to feed scraps of data to their masters. They saw the pattern. They saw the common origin, the 21st founding, and they realized with a dawning, icy horror what they were facing. This was not a case of a few isolated chapters succumbing to mutation or deviancy, a tragic but routine matter to be dealt with by a single inquisitor. This was a plague. This was a systemic, engineered heresy, unleashed on a galactic scale, sanctioned by the very highest authorities on Terra. The taint was not random, it was designed. The mutations were not an accident, they were a product. The scale of this realization cannot be overstated. It meant that the High Lords of Terra, in their arrogance, had potentially compromised the single most vital element of the Imperium's defense. They had played God, and in doing so, had opened 100 new doors for the arch-enemy. The reaction of the Inquisition was not one of debate or deliberation. It was one of absolute, immediate, and utterly ruthless containment. The Ordos intervened not with letters of censure, but with kill teams and exterminatus fleets. The Red Hour began. This was not a war. It was a purge, a silent, brutal, and unrecorded cleansing of the Imperium's own ranks. We have spoken of the survivors, the Black Dragons, the Lamenters, those whose flaws were subtle or useful enough to be grudgingly tolerated, or whose loyalty was so overt it bought them a stay of execution. But what of the others? What of the dozens, perhaps hundreds of other cursed founding chapters whose names are now lost to history? They were the victims of the Red Hour. The Inquisition did not send diplomats. They dispatched their own chamber militant, the silver-armored, psychically pure Grey Knights, to deal with the chapters whose mutations were deemed too demonic, too chaotic to be allowed to exist. The Flame Falcons were not the only ones. Entire chapters were declared excommunicate traitoris, not for any action they took, but for the simple, unforgivable sin of their creation. And where the Grey Knights were not available, or where the heresy was one of loyalty rather than mutation, the Inquisition turned to its new, perfect tool. The bronze-clad Minotaurs were unleashed. They descended upon their fellow 21st founding brethren, their brothers in aberration, and they exterminated them without mercy, without question. It was the ultimate grimdark irony. The success of the cursed founding was used to brutally erase its most overt failures. Battle barges were boarded, fortress monasteries were scoured, and entire complements of flawed Astartes were put to the sword by their fellow perfected abominations. While the military arm of the Inquisition was cleansing the galaxy with bolter and flame, its political arm moved to cleanse the imperial record. A wall of silence, a wall of censure was erected around the entire 21st founding. Every record, every gene log, every astropathic report pertaining to the project was seized. The data vaults on Mars were purged by techno-exorcists. The records in the Administratum on Terra were sealed under the highest possible authority, classified at a level that meant to even ask to see them was to sign your own death warrant. The project was over. Its very existence was to be denied. The term cursed founding began to be whispered, a ghost story told by scribes and adepts, a terrifying legend of what happens when mortals dare to edit the work of a god. And what of the architects? What of the visionary, arrogant Magi biologists who had promised perfection? What of the paranoid High Lords who had commissioned it? The High Lords, protected by their stations, simply remained. They distanced themselves from the project, their involvement buried beneath layers of plausible deniability and bureaucratic obfuscation. But the scientists, the gene rights of Mars, they were not so fortunate. They did not face trials. They were not publicly executed. That would be an admission of guilt. They simply vanished. One by one, the radical Magi who had spearheaded the project were reassigned to listening posts in the Ghoul Stars, or dispatched on exploratory missions into the heart of the Eye of Terror, or simply died in tragic, unavoidable laboratory accidents. The Inquisition was meticulous. The problem was not just to be contained. Its root, its architects, and its very memory were to be excised from the Imperium leaving behind only the living tragic evidence, the surviving chapters, damned to walk the galaxy as eternal reminders of a sin that terror would forever deny. The purge was absolute, but it was not total. The Inquisition, for all its power, is a pragmatic beast. Some of the cursed founding spawn were too visible, too entrenched, or in a twisted way, too useful to be simply erased. The Red Hour ended, the wall of censure was erected, but the living, breathing evidence of the Imperium's sin was allowed to endure. For these surviving chapters, the purge never truly ended. It simply became a permanent state of existence. Their fate was not to be granted forgiveness. Their fate was to become pariahs. Look to the Black Dragons. They were not exterminated. Why? Perhaps their loyalty was too ferocious, their combat record too impressive. Perhaps the Inquisition saw in their berserker fury a useful if monstrous tool. So they were allowed to live. But their lives are a permanent penance. They are the Imperium's untouchables. They are shunned by their fellow Astartes. The sight of their black armor and horned helmets on a battlefield is often met with as much fear from their allies as from their enemies. They are forever watched, forever tested. They are deliberately and cynically assigned to the most hellish, grinding, and hopeless war zones. They are sent to die in places where purer chapters might be spared. They are hurled against impossible odds again and again in a cynical calculus by the High Lords. If they die, a problem is solved. If they win, a victory is secured. For the Imperium's masters, it is a win-win scenario. The Black Dragons know this, and so they fight on their loyalty, burning all the brighter, a desperate, fanatical inferno against the cold, suspicious night of the Imperium. And what of the Lamenters? Theirs is a more poetic, more agonizing damnation. They were spared extermination after the Badab War, their purity of spirit so obvious even in their treason that even the Inquisition had to pause. But their sentence was just a different kind of death. They were condemned to a penitent crusade, a sentence of perpetual warfare, stripped of their fortress monastery, their fleets, and their right to recruit. They are dying. They are a chapter bleeding out, one drop at a time, across 1,000 forgotten battlefields. Their supernatural curse remains a constant, hateful companion. They drift through the galaxy as ghosts, avatars of tragic nobility, fighting and dying to protect an Imperium that sees them as a failed experiment at best and a traitorous aberration at worst. They are allowed to exist only as a monument to their own failure, their loyalty serving only to sharpen the agonizing irony of their fate. They are the walking dead, the Emperor's most loyal, most tragic sons, marching endlessly towards an oblivion that they greet with a profound, unending sorrow. But the most chilling fate was reserved for the success story. The true lesson that the High Lords of Terror learned from the 21st founding was not do not tamper with the Emperor's work. It was not hubris will be punished. No, the lesson they learned was control the outcome. Look to the Minotaurs. They are not pariahs. They are privileged. Their fleets are immaculate. Their war gear is the finest the Adeptus Mechanicus can produce, often including priceless relics of the Great Crusade. They are not watched by the Inquisition. They are directed by the High Lords. They are not shunned. They are feared. The Minotaurs represent the true, horrifying legacy of the cursed founding. They show that the High Lords and the Magi biologists did not abandon their profane quest. They simply perfected it. They learned from the overt, uncontrollable mutations of the Black Dragons. They learned from the metaphysical disaster of the Lamenters. They realized their mistake was not in the act of tampering, but in their lack of control. The Minotaurs are the cursed founding 2.0, a new, refined, and terrifyingly stable product. They are the ultimate expression of the original arrogant dream, a force of Astartes stripped of all independent thought, all compassion, all loyalty, save for a single programmed obedience to the will of terror. They are the High Lord's boot, pressed forever on the neck of any who would dare question their authority. And so the legacy of the 21st founding endures, fractured into three grim realities. It endures as the pariah forced to prove its loyalty through monstrous sacrifice. It endures as the martyr forced to prove its loyalty through tragic, inevitable extinction. And it endures as the tool its loyalty so absolute that it has become the most terrifying monster of all. The curse was not a single event. It is a permanent festering wound, a scar on the Imperium soul that continues to bleed in the 41st millennium. For 10,000 years, the cursed founding stood as the ultimate monument to imperial hubris. It was a sin, a failure, a secret buried so deep that it became a myth. The lesson, it seemed, had been learned: thou shalt not tamper with the Emperor's work. And then the sky broke. The cicatrix maledictum, the great rift, tore the galaxy in two. The Imperium was shattered, bleeding, and on the very brink of total annihilation. From this darkness a savior returned. Robuta Guilliman, the avenging son, primarch of the Ultramarines, was resurrected. And with him he brought a miracle, a man and his army. The man was Archmagos Belisarius Karl. The army was the Primaris Marines. Here in the darkest hour of the 41st millennium, we see the echo of the 36th. Belisarius Karl, a magos biologis of unparalleled genius and arrogance that dwarfed even his failed predecessors, unveiled his life's work. For 10 millennia in secret, he had been doing the exact same thing that birthed the cursed founding. He had been improving the work of the Emperor. His creations were not the flawed, unstable monsters of the 21st. They were perfect. They were bigger, stronger, faster, and more resilient. He had not just tinkered, he had added. He had created 3 new sacred organs: the sinew coils of steel, the Magnificat for endocrine control, the Belisarian furnace for a burst of self-healing. He had, he claimed, stabilized the gene seed. He had fixed the flaws. He presented to his returned Primarch not a new generation of flawed angels, but a new species of demigod. This was the 21st founding's original promise fulfilled. This was the hubris of the age of apostasy, not punished, but vindicated. Or was it? Is Belisarius Karl truly a savior? Or is he merely the most successful, most arrogant, and most dangerous magos biologist in imperial history? Is his success a true miracle, or is it simply a grander, more stable repetition of the exact same unforgivable sin? The madness of the 21st founding was the belief that they could control the divine, that they could fix the soul, that they could use the forbidden. And Karl, in his genius, has shown that he shares this madness completely. For hidden within his Primaris project is the same dark, unforgivable secret that doomed the 21st. It is heavily, terrifyingly implied that Belisarius Karl did not just work with the gene seed of the 9 loyal legions. He too delved into the forbidden vaults. He too believed he could purify the tainted. He too, in his infinite arrogance, took the gene seed of the traitor legions and believed his science was so perfect, his logic so pure, that he could scrub the chaos from them. The madness is not just repeated, it is amplified. Karl's success is not a refutation of the cursed founding, it is its apotheosis. He is the ultimate expression of the belief that mortal hands can perfect the divine. He is the Magi of the 36th millennium, reborn with 10,000 years of resources and an ego to match. And what happens when this new, perfected technology meets the old unyielding curses? What happens when you pour this new, arrogant wine into the cursed founding's cracked and haunted bottles? When the Black Dragons receive the Primaris technology, what happens when they cross the Rubicon? Does the perfection of Kael's design purge their mutation, or do the osseous claws simply grow larger, stronger, and harder their blessing, now amplified by new, superior genetics? When the Lamenters, the avatars of misfortune, are rebuilt with Primaris Marines, is their curse finally lifted? Or does their catastrophic bad luck simply find a new, grander stage? Does their new, perfect battle barge now get lost in the warp for 5 centuries? Do they now attract a hive fleet large enough to devour an entire segmentum? We do not need to guess, we have the answer. The ultimate test, The original sin the Magi of M36 tried to fix, the Black Rage. Belisarius Cawl presented his Primaris Marines to the Blood Angels on bail. He believed in his cold, logical arrogance that his new organs, his stabilized gene seed had finally cured them. He had solved the riddle. He had erased the flaw. He was wrong. In the fires of the Indomitus Crusade, the terrible, unshakable truth was revealed. The Primaris Marines of the Blood Angels are not immune. They too are falling to the Black Rage. They too are consumed by the psychic echo of their Primarch's death. The new perfected hardware is just as vulnerable to the ancient spiritual curse. This is the ultimate damning proof. Cawl, like his predecessors, failed to understand. He too mistook the soul for a machine. He fixed the body, but the curse, the flaw, the echo of the Primarch, it remains. The cursed founding was not an isolated tragedy. It is an ongoing cycle of hubris, and the 41st Millennium has just begun its own new and terrifyingly perfect chapter of the same old madness. Our journey through the sealed archives, through the blood-soaked case files of the Ordo Hereticus, has reached its inevitable grim conclusion. We have walked the shadowed halls of the 21st Founding. We have seen the bestial blessings of the Black Dragons. We have wept for the metaphysical, soul-crushing tragedy of the Lamenters, and we have recoiled from the psychic immolation of the Flame Falcons. We have chronicled the soulless success of the Minotaurs and the quiet, crushing apathy of the Sons of Antaeus. It is easy looking upon this grotesque menagerie of failure to conclude that the madness of the cursed founding was one of biology, a scientific miscalculation, a data error in a gene vat, a tragic but understandable failure of mortals reaching too far too fast. But this is the final seductive lie. It is to miss the entire horrific point. The true madness, the foundational, primordial, and unforgivable sin of the 21st Founding was never the mutation. It was not the claw, the horn, the curse, or the flame. The true madness was the hubris. It was the unbridled, unthinkable, and utterly psychotic arrogance of the mortal mind. It was the psychosis of an entire ruling class, the paranoid High Lords of Terror, the ambitious magi-biologists of Mars who looked upon the divine, soul-scarred, and sacred work of the Emperor of mankind and found it lacking. It was the shared, blasphemous conviction that their clumsy, ignorant, mortal hands could fix the legacy of the demigod Primarchs, that they could correct the divine architecture of a god. This sin is more profound than simple heresy. Heresy is to turn away from your god to worship another. The hubris of the 21st Founding was the sin of attempting to become your god, to place your own cold, flawed logic, your own petty, mortal ambition above the very forces of creation. This was the madness that birthed the project, and this was the madness that ensured its catastrophic damnation. And the universe, in its cold, grim, and poetic irony, answered this arrogance not with a simple failure, but with a perfect, twisted reflection of their own sins. The Imperium set out to create flawless warriors. It sought in its madness to remove the flaws of its greatest heroes. And in this grotesque, arrogant attempt, it did not create perfection. It did not create angels. It created magnificent devils. It forged new, more profound, and more terrifying flaws. The grand, grimdark irony is this: the attempt to remove a flaw only served to amplify it or to create a new, more esoteric curse in its place. In their arrogant attempt to cure the Black Rage and the Red Thirst, a flaw of the soul, they did not create peace. They created the Lamenters. They butchered the spiritual DNA of the Blood Angels, and in the place of that tragic, noble rage, they left a void, a vacuum in the fabric of fate. And the universe in its malice filled that void with a curse of pure supernatural misfortune. They did not remove the flaw. They displaced it, turning an internal struggle into an inescapable external damnation. In their attempt to enhance the strength and resilience of Vulcan's line, they did not create better protectors. They forged the Black Dragons. They pushed the gene seed past its divine limits, and in doing so, created a new flaw, a physical monstrous mutation. A blessing of claws and horns that forces them into a state of perpetual savage zealotry, compelling them to prove their purity through a bestial fury that makes them indistinguishable from the very monsters they fight. In their attempt to blend the best parts of different Primarchs to create a perfect chimeric warrior, they did not create harmony. They created psychic war. They created the screaming spiritual agony of the Flame Falcons, a chapter consumed from within by the warring divine essences of their multiple fathers. Their attempt to combine perfection created only spontaneous terminal annihilation, and finally, in their attempt to program absolute unwavering loyalty, they created the Minotaurs. And here, in their one horrifying success, we see the true madness. They did create the perfect obedient tool, a soulless, brutal engine of terror stripped of honor, empathy, and humanity. A monster that proves the true sin was not in the failure to create perfection, but in the very desire to create it in the first place. This is the ultimate unlearned lesson of the 41st Millennium. The 21st founding was not an anomaly. It was not a single dark chapter, a tragic mistake to be sealed and forgotten. It was a symptom. It is the perfect distilled microcosm of the Imperium of man itself. The Imperium is the cursed founding writ large across 1,000,000 burning worlds. It is an empire built entirely on the crumbling, arrogant foundations of a past it no longer understands. It is a regime that, like the Magi biologies, tinkers with forces far beyond its comprehension, the warp the imperial creed, the very soul of mankind, and believes its dogma and its bureaucracy can control the inferno. It is an empire maintained by the exact same mechanisms that created the 21st founding and then covered it up, a blinding pathological arrogance that refuses to admit fault, and a ruthless paranoid secrecy that purges its own failures rather than learn from them. The madness of the 36th millennium is the madness of the 41st. The cycle is not broken. The hubris is not dead. It is alive and well, and his name is Belisarius Cawl. He is the ultimate expression of the Magi biologist's dream, an architect of perfection with 10,000 years of resources and an ego to match. He too has improved the Emperor's work. He too has used the gene seed of the traitors. And he too has already been proven a failure. His perfect Primaris Marines, his cure for the old flaws. They are not immune. They still fall to the black rage. His science, for all its genius, once again mistook the soul for a machine. He fixed the hardware, but the curse, the flaw, the spiritual scar, that remains. In the end, the cursed founding stands as an eternal screaming monument to this one unlearned truth, a testament that echoes from the age of apostasy to the dark of the Indomitus Crusade. The Imperium is doomed to repeat this cycle of arrogance and self-destruction forever. It will always reach for a perfection it cannot understand. It will always try to fix a divinity that was never broken, only tragic. And it will always create new monsters, new curses, and new, more exquisite tragedies in the process. In the suffocating, grand, and terrible darkness of the far future, there is no redemption. There is no cure. There is no perfection. There are only varying degrees of damnation.